Hello and welcome everybody to this session within our special webinar series on quality and standards in the fight against COVID-19, organized by UNIDO. My name is Dorina Nati and I'm here today with Mr. Nigel Croft, Senior Advisor to UNIDO on quality management and conformity assessment, and with Mr. Bernardo Calzadilla-Sarmiento, who is the Director of the Department of Trade, Investment and Innovation. Well, before we start with our session today, I would like to share with you some information on our webinar series, which has already started about 2 weeks ago. So today we are here with Nigel Croft, and we will talk about auditing and management system certification in times of COVID-19. Our sessions already started on the 17th of April with a panel discussion on standards and testing in the fight against the global pandemic. And we had another session on organizational resilience and one on the role of conformity assessment. After the session today, we will have another one on harnessing innovation and innovation standards for a better world after the crisis, which will take place on 7th of May. In general, if you have any questions, or if you missed any of the previous webinars, or you would like to have information about any of the upcoming webinars, then please refer to our website, which is the Trade, Investment and Innovation Knowledge Hub, which you can reach under tii.unido.org. Having said that, today's session will focus, as mentioned, on auditing and management system certification. We will start with some introductory remarks by Mr. Calzadilla before Mr. Croft presents the topic, and we will follow with a Q&A session. As attendees, you are encouraged to please put your questions in writing in the little Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will then review the questions and ask the most relevant questions to the topic and the context to Mr. Croft. We want to apologize in advance if we will not be able to attain all the questions due to time constraints. We will do our best, of course, to answer most of them. And as we're taking full advantage today of the technology, the session will be recorded, and the recordings will be made available to you after the session. Well, having said that, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Bernardo Calzadilla-Sarmiento, who is the Director of the UNIDO Department of Trade, Investment and Innovation. Bernardo, your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Dorina. Good afternoon. Good afternoon here in Europe. Because I hope we have some participants from Latin America, from Caribbean, but also from Asia. And then for those, good evening and thanks for joining this session. And thank you, Nigel, for being here today. It's really a pleasure. We have been looking from the very beginning. We were challenged as soon as the lockdown started. Well, what happened to us is that we appeared all to be in cyberspace. Yeah, and we are here in cyberspace, and we are not finding the way back yet to our physical world. And those who have access to internet have managed to have some business continuity, some resilience of their activity. And I make emphasis on those who have access, because this reality and COVID has shown that those who are linked to the web may have a future, they are digitalized, but there is a very big digital device. And one of the consequences of COVID is certainly that the digitalization process that was coming in a very accelerated manner with the technology transformation with Industry 4.0, etc., has now been precipitated. Now we found ourselves completely in the digital world. We had a health crisis that is bringing a lot of very deep disruption and transformation, because the impact of this crisis goes well beyond, and I'm talking about one of the emphases, which is the economic dimension, but also in the economy, we had several problems with trade. Unfortunately, we have witnessed a rise of protectionism, especially for those who were not expected to raise protectionist measures in the export sector of medical devices. But also from a positive side, I think what is interesting to see is that climate had a little break, the planet. Wildlife started to be everywhere. I see very nice pictures from Bolivia. People are scared, but we see crocodiles and a lot of wildlife invading the little towns because it is so quiet that nature immediately wakes up. But in terms of what our business is, definitely quality and standards, and I call it, we are in the building, in the business of building confidence, of building consensus, but building confidence. We are called to duty. Standards are called to duty because they can deliver precisely what is required now in crisis, but will be required also in the recovery and in the future, because we will have to reinvent our future. So I don't want to expand very much, and just to thank all cooperations that we have, especially this linking of a global partnership. And while we are in a mode of social distancing, we were very happy that we have very quickly managed to reconnect with our partners, with our friends, with our consultants, to give some support to the countries that are calling for guidance, especially for their SME sectors, for their companies, for rebuilding their industries. So today we will look at something very technical and very specifically, but is of very great importance for building this trust we need in the future. Thank you very much, Nigel. Thank you, Dorina. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Bernardo, for setting the scene. I would like to introduce our guest speaker for today, who is Mr. Nigel Croft. He's recognized as one of the renowned experts in the field of quality management and related standards. So throughout his career, he has held senior executive positions in a number of global organizations. He has been the chairman of ISO's technical committee on TC 176, with overall responsibility of the ISO 9001 standard on quality management. Nigel has been a senior advisor with UNIDO on matters related to quality management and conformity assessment for many years, and he has worked in technical cooperation worldwide. We are very pleased that Nigel is here with us today. And with that, Nigel, I leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorina. Thanks, Bernardo, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I think the appropriate form of greeting is probably the Australian one, which is just good day, and that works whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. So I'm not Australian, but I'll use that form of greeting to everyone. This webinar essentially is a deeper dive into some of the topics that have already been addressed. We had the panel discussion a couple of weeks ago where Xiaojian Hua, Sean McCurtain talked about management system certification as one component of conformity assessment. We had the presentation from Stephanie last week talking about laboratory accreditation and a brief mention of management system certification. So I'm going to be taking, as I say, a deep dive into looking at what does COVID-19 mean to auditing and to the confidence that we can have in management system certification. I must express my gratitude to Sharonda Jeffries, who is the chair of the IAF User Advisory Committee. Sometimes she pinches some of my slides. I've taken the opportunity to pinch some of her slides, and I think that will work well together. Bernardo mentioned about what is certification about, what is conformity assessment about, and he emphasized the use of this word confidence. So in the backdrop to all of this is accredited certification. Customers and other interested parties need to have confidence in their business partners, with the organizations who provide them with products and services. or in the case of other management system certifications other than ISO 9001, we're talking about interested parties like employees and workers when we're talking about health and safety, or neighbors or society when we're talking about the environment and so on. The ISO standard, whether it's ISO 9001, 14001 or whatever, provides the basis for that confidence. We also need to have confidence in the certification body and their ability to do an impartial, competent audit using as a base reference the typically ISO 17021, 17021 Part 1 generic, and the sector or the discipline specific competence requirements, and IAF mandatory and guidance documents. Going up a level, how do we have confidence in the certification body? Well, there brings in the concept of accreditation, accreditation bodies who assess the certification bodies using as a basis 17021 and the IAF multilateral agreement, which conducts peer assessments of the accreditation bodies using 17011. So all of this chain needs to be in place and needs to be operating for those interested parties to have confidence in the organizations that they are doing business with. Now, typically, I think everyone knows there is a 3-year management system certification cycle. Typically starts with an initial stage 1 certification audit, where the certification body checks if that organization is actually ready and is in an adequate state of preparedness to receive an audit. Then that is followed up by the initial certification audit, possibly with review and closeout of non-conformities, a first surveillance audit, a second surveillance audit, typically more or less on a yearly cycle, and before the 3 years up, a recertification audit. If that's successful, certification is continued and we go back into the surveillance. So in other words, this is a gradual progression of ongoing confidence. The situation we're in now is that along comes COVID-19 and it severely restricts physical auditing at all stages of this process. Now, there may be organizations who have applied for certification, gone through the contract review, provided all the documentation, but they haven't yet started the stage 1 audit. There may be organizations who have had the stage 1 audit, but the stage 2 audit physically on site has had to be suspended, and so on. So we have COVID-19 impacting at every one of these stages. So how can we deal with that? The first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is what are the alternatives? How can we provide that ongoing confidence when maybe we can't physically visit the site, either because of travel restrictions or because of concerns about the health and safety impact of our own auditors or the health and safety impact of the organization that we're auditing? So before we get into this question of remote audits, I just thought it would be appropriate, these are my personal observations, to understand what we mean when we talk about physical, virtual, and remote. The IAF MD1, which is IAF mandatory document, in clause 4.6, defines essentially what is a physical site. And it says a site where processes are executed and in a physical environment or from which a service is provided on a continuous basis. So if we are going into a factory or we're going into a hotel or a car rental agency and we are doing the audit, we are doing those face-to-face. Those audits can be face-to-face, or in some cases we may choose to do those on a remote basis, by having remote access to distant locations, which will help us to increase the audit sampling. But equally, there are some sites which are, by their very nature, virtual. And that is where the client organization performs work or provides a service using an online environment that allows people working from home or from different physical locations to execute those processes. It may be a design and development process where you have people from all over the world taking part in a virtual cloud-based scenario, and it's something that you cannot do a physical audit. There's nothing to audit. So in the case of a virtual site, essentially, audits can only be remote. Now, sometimes we end up mixing these two words to deal with the question of audit. Instead of talking about remote audits, sometimes we use the phrase virtual audit. I don't actually like that phrase virtual audit because the audit is very real. There's nothing virtual about it. It's being done remotely using information and communication technologies. Now, if we look back to the history, I think we need to understand the history to understand the future and to be able to make our decisions. 15 years ago, I still had quite a lot more hair, although it's what little bit I've got is getting a little bit out of hand. But in what I call the pre-2005 era, remote auditing or virtual auditing was treated with a lot of suspicion. There were concerns about credibility of management system certification. There were concerns about cut price audits, using, maybe a recently graduated cheap auditor with a video camera going through a factory and being able to reduce travel time, reduce travel expenses, and do a more superficial audit. So those concerns led to the development of the IAF MD4 2008 version, which I actually convened back in the mid-2000s, and that came out with the mandatory document for the use of computer-assisted auditing techniques, or CAAT as we knew it, for accredited certification of management systems. That is the group which Sharonda Jeffries now convenes, and that's been through a couple more revised iterations. But MD4 2008 essentially took that disciplining of the use of remote auditing techniques. Its aim was to provide a methodology that is sufficiently flexible and non-prescriptive in nature to satisfy the needs of industry, allowing client organizations and CBs to use computer-assisted auditing to enhance the conventional audit process. And by that we mean, as I mentioned, maybe doing more sampling than we would otherwise be able to do. If there are maybe 100 different maintenance officers, for example, it would be difficult to do a sample of physical audits in the square root of those maintenance shops. If we can do it remotely, that will help us. It may be difficult access to remote locations or to dangerous locations. But equally, the concern was to ensure that adequate controls are in place with sufficient accreditation body oversight to avoid abuses. And so in that scenario, the limitation was that if remote auditing activities were to represent more than 30% of the planned on-site auditor time, then the certification body had to justify its audit plan and obtain specific approval from the accreditation body before implementing. Now, times have changed. In the sort of 2005 era, this is very much how information and communication technology looked. If we fast forward to 2020, we have smartphones which we never had before. We can do virtual reality. We've got Zoom meetings. We've got drones. We've got Google Specs. We've got GoPro. All of those kind of things, and the paradigm shift is phenomenal. Instead of regarding remote auditing as a potential threat as it was in the early 2000s, between the last 15 years, remote auditing has become more widespread to enhance traditional auditing methodologies. I said auditing virtual sites where it's impossible to do a physical audit, access to difficult, dangerous locations, and improved sampling. Now, many who work in the IT arena are very accustomed to this way of conducting their internal audits, conducting their external audits. But now, within the last 3 months, it's not become something that's nice to do to enhance traditional methodologies. It's become very much a strategic imperative. Now, I think one of the important things is for us to recognize that the framework to deal with COVID-19 already exists in the management system certification arena. We have the publication of IAF's informative document, Management of Extraordinary Events or Circumstances. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. We've evolved the old MD4, which is now called Use of ICT for Auditing and Assessment Purposes, the latest edition published 2018. A lot of emphasis on remote auditing in the latest version of ISO 19011, the guidance on auditing management systems, a whole annex of guidance dedicated to the question of auditing. Coupled with that, we've got IAF Informative Document 12, Principles on Remote Auditing, and the very, very recent joint ISO-IAF Auditing Practices Group guidance on remote audits. Now, I'll show you later, but all of these documents, with the exception of 19011, these are all available on the IAF website, free of charge for consultation purposes. And I would very much recommend you to do that. But if we look at the ID3 document published in 2011, it defines what we mean by an extraordinary event or circumstance. And it's a circumstance beyond the control of the organization, what we typically understand as a force majeure. And it gives a number of examples: war, strike, riot, political instability, terrorism, flooding, earthquake, etc., etc. Included in those is pandemic. In the way in which, in the scenario in which ID3 was written, most of those we were typically thinking in terms of local or regional phenomena. You know, tsunami, the SARS crisis, which did actually become more than just a regional phenomenon, but it wasn't definitely a global thing that shut down everybody. Now, ID3 applies to affected certified organizations, to their certification bodies and their accreditation bodies. And so if you have an earthquake hit region, or you have some terrorist activities or whatever, that may shut down some organizations, some certification bodies, and some accreditation bodies. But COVID-19 is a global phenomenon, and it affects all ABs, all CBs, and all certified organizations, as well as the IAF. So it's a very, I would say, a very extreme application of what was forecast in ID3. But if we focus on the accredited certification of management systems, ID3 recommends that accreditation bodies and CBs, in consultation with their certified organizations, should come up with a reasonable planned course of action. So what does that mean? It means assessing the risks of continuing certification. It means having policies and processes in place to outline the steps it will take in the event of an extraordinary event. Think about methods for evaluating the current and expected future situation of the certified organization, and define alternative potential short-term methods of assessment to verify the ongoing effectiveness of its management system. So here we're very much looking at the possibilities of remote auditing. Now, some of the information to be considered, again, I'm taking this directly from IAF ID3. If we're honest, I don't think we know the answer to some of these questions. You know, when will the organization be able to function normally? We don't know. You know, back in February, we were thinking this may be something that might last a month, 6 weeks, 2 months. Now we're thinking maybe it's a 6 month or at least a year's phenomenon. And this will vary very much within the regions. When will the organization be able to ship products or perform the certification? Again, we don't know. If certification is to a management system standard that requires a disaster recovery or emergency response plan, has the organization implemented the plan? Was it effective? So there we were thinking very much in terms of, you know, tsunami or an earthquake, where maybe there was an environmental emergency plan or health and safety emergency plan. But in the current scenario, there is one management system standard, obviously, which is very, very important, which is 22301 for business continuity management. And we will be able to really look at and see if the organization's business continuity management systems were effective in dealing with this crisis. Process for dealing with the extraordinary events, at a minimum, it should address, and I can't emphasize this strongly enough, proactive communication between the affected organizations and the certification body. I'll not go through all these bullet points one by one. Let me just highlight a couple of them. Maximum time on alternative short-term assessment methods that could be used before suspension of certification is mandatory. So can we delay assessments? Can we do remote assessments ad infinitum for another 5 years? I think that's very unlikely. And so we need to think about what is the maximum length of time. Criteria for renewing normal oversight and ensuring that any deviation from accreditation requirements, and I should add scheme owner requirements for sector-specific schemes, and CB procedures, make sure that's documented and agreement is reached with the accreditation body. So a global phenomenon requires a global response. This is not just a question of one accreditation body or half a dozen accreditation bodies coming up with their own specific responses to this crisis. IAF has been very, very proactive in coordinating this. The IAF policies and documents typically are deployed to the regional and the national accreditation body levels. And as I said a couple of seconds ago, different scheme owners may have different criteria. For example, the automotive, food safety, agricultural arena, and so on. If you go to the IAF website up here, you will find an area dedicated to COVID-19. And in that, there are a series of frequently asked questions that are very, very informative and very, very useful. Here is just a small sample of the different policies from people like ANAB, the US accreditation body, RVA in Holland, FSSC, which is a food safety certification organization, British Retail Consortium, and so on. But essentially, all of these organizations are recommending the move towards remote auditing. Whether it's DAX, UCAS, ANAB, who are saying they will no longer conduct any face-to-face assessments of their assessment of certification bodies, and some of the certification bodies deciding no longer to conduct on-site audits. Now, IAF MD4, which is the update of the document that I referred to right at the beginning, is very clear. Remote auditing is allowed. All requirements, including observation of activities, can be audited remotely using the appropriate methodologies. We need to make sure that there's an infrastructure in place for the technology and also consider security and confidentiality needs. Make sure we identify and document the risks and opportunities of the technology that may impact the effectiveness of the audit. Ensure that auditors and audit clients are competent to use the appropriate technologies. And finally, recognize that remote auditing is not necessarily a quick solution, an opportunity to reduce audit time. I think those of you who've been involved in remote auditing will recognize that quite significant additional planning may be necessary, and that could impact the audit duration. These are some of the IT options that we've got available. I certainly don't intend to go through all of those. Some of them you will be very familiar with. Skype, FaceTime, WhatsApp, Google Hangouts. We've got WebEx, we've got GoToMeetings, we've got Zoom. All of them are possibilities for us to conduct remote interviews. Coupled, of course, with things like GoPro, drones, giving us remote access to documentation and to the processes that we're actually concerned with. We may have remote access protocols in place to allow us to verify in real time process data, process performance data, measurement monitoring data that will allow us to have that confidence that the processes are being carried out effectively and efficiently. The third topic that I said I would address, ISO 19011, the third edition, published in 2018. And in the annex, 19011 talks about the different audit methods, on-site and remote. In other words, remote where there is a human interaction, things like conducting interviews, observing work performed with a remote guide, completing checklists, questionnaires, and so on. And those where there is no human interaction, where we may be doing document review, looking at records, observing work performed via surveillance means, considering social and statutory and regulatory requirements, or analyzing data. In the appendix to 19011, again, just highlighting a few topics here. The feasibility of remote audit activities can depend on the level of risk to achieving the audit objectives, the level of confidence between the auditor and the auditee's personnel, and any regulatory requirements. So these are all things that we need to take into consideration when a certification body is looking at extending the validity of an organization's certification beyond that would be otherwise valid if it weren't for COVID-19. Remote audits. Now, 19011 does actually mention that auditing a virtual location is sometimes referred to as virtual auditing. As I said earlier, I personally don't like that term because we're doing actually very real audits. It's just that they're not being done on a face-to-face basis. But some of the guidance, we need to make sure that auditors have the technical skills to use the appropriate electronic equipment. They have experience in facilitating meetings virtually, that they consider the risks associated with virtual or remote audits. In other words, it's up to the auditor still to determine the sampling methodologies, to make sure that the auditee is not just taking them to places where the auditee wants them to see and is convenient to be audited remotely. We have to make sure we try to avoid background noise, disruptions and interruptions. Asking for permission in advance to take screenshot copies. There may be confidential documents, and it's very, very easy to take a screenshot if you are auditing, and that may come back and bite you later if there are confidentiality issues. One very important thing, ensure confidentiality and privacy during audit breaks. Muting microphones, pausing cameras. Very, very critical, of course, if you need to go to the bathroom. I'm sure people don't want you sharing that by audio and even less by video means. Finally, we have the guidance from the joint ISO and IEF auditing practices group. This is the website. You can access it either via the IEF website or via the ISO main website or the ISO TC 176 website. And the most recent document, which was posted, I think, about 15 days ago, talks very specifically about remote audits. That's one of a series of around 30 sort of guidance documents, hints and tips on good auditing practices. And again, these are all available free of charge online, and in fact have been translated into a number of different languages that you should be able to access via that site. Sharonda Jeffries gave me a few tips and techniques in her world, the ICT world. This is something that is very much consolidated, and her recommendations are: take extra time in planning and communicating, consider the length of each audit interview and schedule breaks. You know, auditing can be quite intense at the best of times, but remote auditing can be even more intense. So we have to make sure that we do schedule breaks and we don't sort of let our minds wander too much during the remote auditing process. Do as much pre-work as possible. Preload the agenda, ask auditees to bring laptops, webcams, and so on. Allocate specific additional time for audit interviews. Maybe that we need to set those up sort of on the hoof as we go along. Hopefully not, but that may take a little bit longer than if we're in a real audit and we say, oh, could you ask so-and-so to come in and just explain this to us? That so-and-so person may not be immediately available in a remote auditing environment. Resist inviting more people to audit interviews. Now, it can be very, very intimidating for the interviewee to have half a dozen people or 10 people who are basically just acting as observers, and that can inhibit the exchange of information. Typically, we would try to use an on-site host to address issues, and we want to minimize side conversations, side chats, and instant messaging. Be familiar with tool features, any tools that we do actually use. Be aware of bandwidth issues. Be prepared to familiarize others with the tools and know who or how to contact people for help with the tools. So we've got Yaroslava, for example, on this call, hiding away in the background, but if things go haywire, I know I can contact Yaroslava to help to recover the situation. And always, always, always have backup plans in place. Here are just a few examples from the IEF COVID-19 updated frequently asked questions. I will go through them extremely quickly. It's important to look at the IEF website for complete responses. I've just given a sort of short answer, but the IEF website does give very, very complete and comprehensive responses, including any sort of provisos or any explanatory text that might be necessary. So for schemes under the IEF MLA, how are conformity assessment activities to be managed in this extraordinary period? The short answer: look at IEF MD4 for remote auditing and look at ID3 on extraordinary events. Could time duration for closure of non-conformities be prolonged, taking into consideration the COVID-19 outbreak? The short is yes, and the time frame in general that the IEF is suggesting for now is 6 months. 6 month prolongation of surveillance audits, prolongation of recertification audits, prolongation of the time for closure of non-conformities. Is it possible to perform a full initial certification audit remotely? The short answer is yes, it is possible, but of course there are a lot of implications and they need to be taken into consideration. Is Ief Id3 still applicable, even though that refers to an accreditation standard that's no longer valid? In other words, the old version of 17021. The short answer is yes, and of course we just update the reference. If there's a postponement of 6 months in the deadline of a certificate, when will the next certification cycle begin? And the answer is we keep the original deadline. Even if we allow for delay in the recertification audit, the expiry date continues to be valid for the next 3-year certification cycle. What will happen to transition periods? You know, we're in the middle of the transition to ISO 22000, to ISO 50001 2018 version. The answer is, will they be extended? Yes, they will. If a CB conducts part of the initial certification with a remote audit, but plans to complete the remainder of the audit on site within 6 months, can it issue the certificate at the conclusion of the remote audit activities? Answer, no. And again, we need to look at the complete to understand that better. Is it exclusively managed system certification? Again, the short answer is no. It can also be for validation and verification. So at the end of the day, it becomes a question of risk. Is the risk of not doing an audit less than the risk of doing an audit using ICT? Of course, if we're not auditing at all, then that protects the health and safety of everybody. It allows organizations to focus on their operations without disruption, but it means there is no oversight. It may mean relaxed mandates for certification in the supply chain and possibilities of fraud and potential liability aspects for the certification body by extending certificate validity without oversight. If, on the other hand, we do audit using remote methodologies, we continue to protect health and safety, we can include an audit of business continuity, risk management in real time, and it does allow us with some level of oversight. And the final slide I wanted to share with you, and this is a hypothetical situation, it's oversimplified, but this might be a typical decision tree that a certification body could go through in looking at the COVID-19 crisis. First of all, is the risk of conducting an on-site audit high? If it's not, either because there is very few cases of COVID-19 in that particular country or region, or the peak has passed or whatever, then go ahead and conduct the on-site audit and continue with the certificate. If the risk, the health and safety risk, is high, next question, is the organization still working? If the organization has suspended all its activities, then we may consider suspending the certificate in communication with the client. And everybody may be quite happy with that as a temporary solution. If the organization is still working, we need to ask, is a remote audit feasible? If it's not, can the audit be postponed? What's the limits? And as I mentioned earlier, typically 6 months. If the audit cannot be postponed, then the only alternative is probably to suspend the certificate. If the audit can be postponed, then we go ahead and postpone the audit. If a remote audit is feasible, is a full remote audit possible? If yes, then we conduct the full remote audit and continue with the certification. Maybe a surveillance audit. It may involve looking at key topics like management review, internal audits, corrective actions, policy deployment, and so on. If the answer is no, then we would try to conduct a partial remote audit and then provisionally continue the certificate and review the situation periodically. Typically on a month-by-month basis. Is the organization still working? What's the potential? Are they delivering products and services? And so on. So essentially, that's what I wanted to share with you. There is no yes-no solution. I think the key messages are, think about the risks. Think about the risks to the ongoing situation of providing confidence to organizations in the supply chain. Think about using remote audits and maintain total transparency and communication with everything that you do. So Dorina, let me pass that back to you, and happy to take questions that you may, anybody may have submitted.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I think this was a very interesting presentation, and it gave us all some food for thought of how we will have to change the way we work, not only now, but probably for the future. We have received plenty of questions. I would just like to reiterate, if you have any questions, please put them in the little Q&A box at the bottom of your window, and we will try to ask as many as we can to Nigel while we are here. Nigel, let me start with a general question of understanding, because you said you don't like the term virtual audit so much, so you have been using the term remote audit mainly. Are there any differences between a virtual and a remote audit, or is this just a matter of terminology?
If there are differences, they are too subtle for me to understand. I do see the two terms very often used interchangeably, but I think there is a gradual trend to using remote audit rather than virtual audit. What we are actually doing is a remote audit of a virtual location, which we have to do anyway, or it can be a remote audit of a physical location using ICT.
Thank you, Nigel. In case such a remote audit, well, now we're all doing, everywhere we're doing remote audits. But still some auditors, they insist on doing on-site audits because they don't trust the way the remote audits are done for the time being. So I think in general, we're back to what we discussed before, which is a matter of trust. So how can we ensure through the remote audits the right level of trust on everybody's side, so on the auditor side, on the auditee side, and also for the validity of the results of the audit?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to risk. It all comes down to knowing your client, if you're a certification body. Not only knowing the client, but knowing the other interested parties who make decisions based on your certification. It may be a discipline-specific decision. So maybe a certification body might decide, well, the quality component of the management system, we can audit that remotely and no problems. But the health and safety aspects, we actually, raised some non-conformities in the last audit, or we know there are issues, and therefore we don't feel comfortable in auditing those things remotely. And there may be different postures depending on the specific nature of the management system that's being audited. Likewise, I mentioned earlier, we have scheme owners, different scheme owners, like, for example, IATF for the automotive 16949 audit scheme. We may have GFSI, who have just published some documentation on remote auditing. They may have their own very, very specific criteria, either supporting remote audits in certain situations, or just flat out saying no, remote auditing is not acceptable. So I think there are all of those, I like the phrase risk-based thinking, that's the phrase we used in ISO 9001. It comes down to what's the level of criticality of the industry that we are being asked to audit? What's the potential impact and what are the implications if we take a decision to extend the audit, the certification validity, either without doing an audit or doing it virtually? What's the potential liability of that? If there's a nuclear disaster and we've not done an audit, what are the regulatory requirements related to that audit? So it's a whole long sort of shopping list of risk-related issues that ultimately the certification body has to sort of bring all of these topics together and make a decision.
Thank you, Nigel.
So basically my response is there is no black or white answer to it.
Thank you, Nigel. This kind of brings me to my next question, which relates to food production and food safety, which is not only an essential business during these times, but it's also something that, that requires on-site auditing in most of the cases. So in this specific case, what do you think are the possibilities of auditing food safety and food safety management systems in companies that are producing and would like to renew their certificate or get a certificate during these times of COVID-19?
Well, I think, again, this depends on the kind of audit. And I didn't go into too much detail, but I think we have to differentiate between a certification, initial certification, or a recertification audit, and the intermediate surveillance audits. The easy option is for the initial certification audit, where the certification body may say, you know, we don't feel comfortable in doing a remote audit for the initial certification, and we would need to go on site to do at least part of the audit, and we would only issue a certificate once we've actually done that. We may be able to sort of advance the planning a little bit. We may be able to do the stage 1 audit remotely. We may be able to do part of the certification audit remotely, but we will only issue a certificate after we've been on site. To some extent, the same thing for a recertification audit. So at the end of the 3-year cycle, when there's a full audit to be carried out, we do have some flexibility with the 6-month extension. But if I were a certification body, I would be looking very long and hard at the ongoing performance of the organization that I've certified. And again, there are no hard and fast rules, but I'd be looking at things like, how long have they been certified? Any major non-conformities raised in the last audit cycle? Any significant number of minor non-conformities that have been raised? Are there any specific COVID-19 or health-related topics going on around that particular sector? You know, has there been an outbreak of listeria, for example, in a particular arena, or is there evidence that there's a salmonella is becoming rife? They would be things I would be looking at to determine the level of confidence that I have overall, and I would be making the decisions based on that. Now, if it's just a routine surveillance audit, you know, the first or second surveillance audit during the cycle, when the main things that I want to be looking at are things like, is the organization managing its own system? Are they doing their internal audits? How are they doing them? Are they raising non-conformities? Are they looking at root causes and, you know, dealing with corrective actions and so on? Are they doing the management reviews? And I can have a discussion virtually with some of the key people in that facility. Then it may be that I say, okay, you know, I'm comfortable with that. And we can do all of that virtually, but not necessarily the recertification audit. So again, that's a personal opinion from my perspective. It's not definitive IAF guidance, because I don't think you can actually give a prescriptive answer to every individual case.
Thank you, Nigel. In general, we get a lot of questions from accreditation bodies and certification bodies, and they would like to know is there any guidance available for them how to conduct remote audits, because this is such a new setup, let's say, that we're all not so familiar with. So is there any general guidance that we can give to accreditation bodies and certification bodies when doing remote audits?
Well, I think the easy answer to that is to consult the IAF ID13, I can't remember, the IAF guidance on conducting remote audits. I think we've got the ISO IAF Auditing Practices Group guidance. At a personal level, I'm a great believer in piloting things, validating them. So when the question came in from accreditation bodies and certification bodies, I would strongly suggest try it out in a non-critical situation. You may try to do some internal audits of your own organization and get a feel for and start building confidence in your ability to use remote audits, use them as guinea pigs, and then go on to actual audit clients. Now, there are a number of, I'm not sure what the accessibility is, but I know that I'd mentioned Sharonda Jeffries before. I know that Sharonda has been conducting a series of webinars, some of them internal for the IAF, but also for the American Society for Quality, and some of the, I think it's the, one of the auditor registration schemes. So if you go online, you know, I would say use my good friend, Dr. Google, and see what's out there. There is a lot of good information out there, and some of it very, very innovative. But don't be afraid to try it. I would say that's the best way. Don't be afraid to try it, but try it in a non-critical situation until you feel confident to use it in real, real auditing situations.
Thank you, Nigel. Another important aspect of auditing is not only the review of documentation and the on-site visits, but it's also the personal interviews and especially the verbal, as we know, and the non-verbal communication that an auditor takes into account when doing the audits. So this is an aspect that through the remote audits, I don't want to say it gets lost, but maybe it gets more difficult to evaluate. So how would you take that into account, the non-verbal communication mostly?
Well, I think always we have, there is the concept of the guide in any audit, the sort of contact person. And in a remote audit, we talk about the host. That has to be somebody who is acting as our eyes and ears in the organization itself. They may be walking around with a GoPro stuck to their helmet, and maybe I say, can you go left a little bit? Or can you just do a 360 just so that I can see what's going on? If the organization is actually working. And I may say, can you go over there? I'd like to talk to that person. Because that person's sort of hiding in a corner. Please don't choose me, please don't choose me. And I actually want to go over and talk to them. I don't just, as in any audit situation, as an auditor, I have to take great care that I am not being led around to be shown things that the organization wants me to see. So maybe remote access to documents. If I have remote access to an intranet documentation site, then maybe I can, I always say when I'm auditing electronic documents, as an auditor, I want to be in charge of the mouse. The mouse, I don't want, okay, I'd like to see this process. And the auditee goes click, 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 pulls up about 5 different screens and shows me just one I want to get a panorama. So I think in a remote auditing situation, I would use the same sort of approach. I would say, hold on a minute, can we just slow it down? Could you go back? And I'd like to see how you got to this document. I'd like to see, the selection. And instead of choosing this one, could you choose this example or this supplier records? And do you mind if I use the mouse? And then I can make the appropriate selections. So I think it's a question of that sort of good-humored but proactive approach, where I'm not just being led around by the nose, doing things that the auditee wants me to see.
Thank you, Nigel. These are very interesting ideas, and I think they're interesting to all of us. One last question, because unfortunately we're running out of time. So we were kind of forced into this situation through COVID, and we were forced to have remote audits from one day to the other. And now we're in a situation where most of the audits are done remotely. But do you think this is a setup that is here to stay? So do you think this is something that will be valid only now in times of COVID, or do you think remote audits will be something that will enter the auditing world for a longer period of time?
Well, I think the buzz phrase at the moment that is irritating me, but everybody's talking about the new normal. What will the new normal look like? And I think the new normal will certainly have opened our eyes to the possibilities of using remote auditing. I think it does allow us a whole load of opportunities, and I think we will certainly, my personal opinion, we will certainly see more percentage of audits being done remotely, and I think probably we will have greater efficiency because of that. We need to make sure that we keep the same levels of confidence. Do I think 100% remote auditing will substitute face-to-face auditing? Absolutely not. Except in those cases where even now auditing is done remotely because it's a virtual organization and all its processes are being conducted virtually. In those cases, we have no choice. We have to do remote audits and use the methodologies that we have available.
Thank you. Yes, Nigel?
So just a final comment. You know, much of what I've said, where I've referred to IAF documents and ISO documents, that's IAF and ISO speaking. Where I've sort of gone off script and given my own personal observations, you know, maybe some people will want to come and fight with me and say, no, that's your personal viewpoint. And it is. But I think one thing that I want to emphasize, there is no prescriptive one-size-fits-all approach. It's all about judging risks, and it's all about making sure that we have confidence in what we're doing, and we're able to transmit that confidence to the relevant interested parties for the management systems.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I think this was a very good closing statement. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. We got a lot of questions. I hope we could answer a good part of them. I hope everybody got something out of this session, which I personally found very interesting. I just want to say that we will make the slides and the recordings available for any information that you would like to have on this session, on previous sessions, or on future sessions. Please go to tii.unido.org and you will find more information there. We always get a lot of questions, so please send out the slides and send out the recordings. If you want more information, please go to the website. I would like to remind you that we have another session on innovation and innovation standards and how to build a better world after COVID-19. The session will take place on Thursday. And again, to register for the session, please go to tii.unido.org. And with that, I want to say thank you very much to Nigel. It was really a very informative webinar. We had a lot of participants, I would say up to 300 or more. The feedback I got in the meanwhile through the chat and the Q&A was very positive. Thank you everybody for having been here with us today, and we look forward to see you soon in one of our future webinars. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.